The urban terrain is like a defensive dream. It really gives you the ability to rapidly conduct this engagement area development. The roads already funnel people into kill zones. And if you shape it right, it can become combat in hell.
Poland, September 1st, 1939. Nazi Germany, followed by the Soviet Union on the 17th, invaded and quickly defeated the Polish military in a rapid campaign. The Polish government fled to London, establishing a government in exile. German troops entered the capital city of Warsaw on October 1st, exactly 1 month after they crossed the Polish border.
My mother, we were living in Warsaw, but my mother was worried that I would get into trouble. So she sent me to the provincial town of Biała Podlaska, where my granddaughter lived. And I was to be safe there. But there was my cousin living there, whose father is major in the army, was now prisoner of war. And two of us decided that in Biała Podlaska there is no underground movement. And we started our own private one.
The Polish army was facing defeat, and the seeds of clandestine organizations began to grow. The government in exile had no control over these disparate groups. One cell did not know the existence of other cells within the country. Over time, these groups became aware of one another and began to collaborate. They were sometimes opposites in political ideology, but were united in their determination to free the Polish people from the nightmare of German occupation. Resistance cells grew from families, friendships, neighborhoods, universities, athletic federations, and even the Szare Szeregi, the disbanded Polish Boy Scouts. The Narodowe Siły Zbrojne, known as the NSZ, was a paramilitary group of Polish veterans who had not been killed or captured by the Germans or Soviets in 1939. Although far-right in its ideology, nationalist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic, they were ardently anti-Nazi. On the left, there were two prominent groups: Battaliony Chłopskie, the so-called peasant battalions, and the Armia Ludowa, or AL. These two groups had strong ties to the Soviets and were committed to establishing Poland as a communist state after the war. Just like the NSZ, the left was equally committed to the liberation of Poland. The Armia Krajowa, AK, or Home Army, was the largest and most well-known insurgent group that sprang out of the motley collection of resistance cells. These independent cells eventually merged into an umbrella organization that subordinated itself to the Polish government in exile. Not content with acts of sabotage or the assassination of Nazi officials and Polish collaborators, the founders and later the government in exile intended for this organization to fight for the liberation of Poland. One of the significant strengths of the AK and other resistance organizations was their vast intelligence and surveillance network. The AK discovered the Germans were developing both the V-1 and V-2 rockets in the coastal city of Peenemünde. This led to a bombing raid by the British Royal Air Force, which delayed the rocket's production by months. The AK captured an intact V-2 rocket and sent detailed descriptions of its components to the Allies in London. The AK gave precise locations of German logistical hubs and troop movements. This was possible because their operatives had penetrated the postal service and rail system. the resistance organization provided the Allies with the first concrete evidence of the Nazis' industrialized mass murder of Jewish people and others taking place inside Poland. Their actions were invaluable to the Allied war effort. However, to the east, a red storm was approaching. The Red Army's summer offensive in June 1944 had cracked the Eastern Front wide open, destroying the German Army Group center. Soviet troops were rapidly approaching the Polish capital. To preserve the possibility of a democratic Poland, the AK and the government in exile wanted to be in control of Warsaw prior to the Soviets' arrival. After days of deliberation, they settled on 1 August 1944 as the beginning of the uprising. General Bur Komorowski had assembled what appeared to be a formidable force. The AK had approximately 300,000 soldiers throughout the country, including almost 4,500 women in critical roles. Inside Warsaw, the AK had between 30,000 and 50,000 soldiers dispersed throughout the 6 distinct sections of the city. Unfortunately, they were desperately short of weapons and ammunition. By any stretch of the imagination, this was a pittance. Shortly before the end of the initial German invasion, in 1939, a significantly higher number of weapons and ammunition had been cached across the country, mostly by burying. Much of the weapons and ammunition recovered from these sites were unserviceable. Those that were recovered and eventually used represented roughly 30% of what was anticipated. If they managed to capture all their objectives, the Poles would be hard-pressed to hold out longer than 72 hours against even moderate resistance. Known as Operation Tempest, a plan for a general uprising in Poland had existed for some time. On August 1st, Bur Komorowski's forces inside Warsaw were prepared to seize numerous objectives. By assigning so many objectives, the AK lacked the necessary combat power to control key terrain, a critical flaw in its plan. Soldiers tasked with securing these objectives fanned out across the city, moving toward their designated assembly areas, sometimes as individuals, sometimes in groups of 2 or 3. Upon arrival, they reassembled as squads, platoons, companies, or understrength battalions. At 1700, Warsaw, a city of 1.5 million people, erupted in the smoke, fire, haze, and chaos of urban conflict. The Germans were not oblivious to the possibility of a general uprising. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, head of the Abteilung Fremde Heer Ost, or Department for Foreign Armies in the East, had been monitoring the Polish resistance movement for some time. Gehlen and his officers were primarily focused on those organizations supported by or ideologically connected to the Soviet Union, such as the AL and the Peasant Battalions. By July 1944, Gehlen alerted the German High Command that a widespread uprising was imminent. The Germans, primarily due to Gehlen's influence, assumed that any uprising would originate from the forests and marshes of eastern Poland rather than from an urban environment such as Warsaw. Preparations for urban conflict were not undertaken by the Germans until the late spring of 1944. The garrison commander of Warsaw, General Rainer Stahl, seemingly had an adequate force to defend the city. Altogether, roughly 12,000 troops to secure a city of 1.5 million people that occupied a space of roughly 517 square kilometers. According to Army Techniques publication 3-06, planning considerations generate tasks which produce effects that bring about a desired end state. The Army's operational concept and urban operations contain combinations of decisive action tasks of offense, defense, and enabling operations. Effects produced from tasks can be desirable or undesirable. They may help achieve or impede attainment of an objective. In addition to decisive action tasks, commanders engaged in urban operations understand fundamentals that apply to any urban environment. Because all cities are different, urban operations often differ from one operation to the next. Plans use these fundamentals in lines of operation or lines of effort to create cumulative, complementary effects greater than a single task effect observed in isolation. A positive correlation or synergy exists between conducting a greater number of tasks well and the probability of urban operations success. No fundamental is essentially more important than another if isolated. Commanders develop measures of performance and effectiveness metrics to assess progression, digression, or regression. Some of these fundamentals are not exclusive to urban environments, and they are not necessarily conducted in sequential order, yet they are particularly relevant to an environment dominated by man-made structures and a dense non-combatant population. Both the AK and German forces struggled with many of these concepts throughout the campaign.
I knew the uprising was going to start that day, 1st of August, yeah. And I was waiting for the orders, yeah, in my house, my apartment, by the telephone.
On August 1st, 1944, at 1700 local time, the uprising began. The AK was able to mobilize more than 60% of their available forces, but because of the severe equipment shortages, many soldiers were without a weapon of any kind. Early Polish success proved difficult, with objectives spread throughout the city. Bor Komorowski and his staff had divided the city into 6 areas of operation based on the 6 major districts: the Old Town, city center, Żoliborz, Wola, Ochota, Mokotów, and Praga, as well as the bridges on the Wisła River. The capture of these bridges intact were vital to allow the Red Army to pass through rather than force a series of contested wet gap crossings. The Wisła River was an additional handicap for the AK forces tasked with seizing Praga, since the district lay on the opposite bank of the river. The need to use and leverage well-trained, integrated, and rehearsed combined arms teams cannot be overstated. Those forces must have the training, organization, weapon systems, and skills to rapidly and violently isolate an urban objective, gain a foothold through shock action, and secure it against a determined enemy, maximizing maneuver, fire support, and effective small unit leadership to overcome that enemy. In the city center, the AK attempted to seize university buildings, police headquarters, and the Palace of the Council of Ministers. Many of these attacks failed to secure their objectives, and the cost was high. All attempts to seize the still intact bridges over the Wisła failed. The 103rd AK Company lost 42 soldiers, including their commander, in the attempt to seize the Kirbij Bridge. In another attempt, on a different bridge, the Gartuch Gromada Group lost 120 soldiers. By the end of the first day's fighting, the AK had achieved very few of its objectives. North of the city center, the AK managed to seize warehouses with German rations and other critical supplies. German security forces were spread so thin they could not defeat the initial pockets of Polish success. Janusz Tomaszewski joined the resistance in 1939 at 11 with some of his fellow Grey Scouts. He quickly graduated from the underground Grey Rank Scouts to the Baszta Regiment. 5 years later, he was a captain in the regiment. He was only 16. On 31 July, he received instructions to proceed to an assembly area, a villa across the street from a school occupied by 300 members of the SS. The Mokotów district was key terrain in the southern portion of Warsaw. By controlling this district, the AK could deny the Germans quick access to the city center and several bridges over the Wisła. By 1500, The sounds of explosions and automatic weapons fire could already be heard sporadically across the city. Janusz was issued a revolver and a few rounds of ammunition, and then he waited. At precisely 1700, Janusz and his fellow soldiers began their attack on the German positions. Operating out of the school had placed improved fighting positions on every corner of the building, and crew served weapons on the rooftop of this key terrain. After a failed attempt, attacking across a potato field during the day, Janusz and his men regrouped. They planned a second attack for later that night. The attack began at 0400 in a rainstorm. The sound of explosions filled the darkness as Polish sappers created multiple breach points in the walled compound. A combination of automatic weapons fire, grenades, and petrol bombs neutralized the fighting positions that had caused so much difficulty earlier in the day. Once inside the building, the AK moved from room to room, clearing each as they went along. During the room clearing process, Janusz found himself pinned down in a narrow hallway, engaged in a firefight with the SS. His soldiers managed to circle back around, attacking the Germans that had trapped him and ending the engagement. Eventually, the surviving Germans fled, leaving the school in the hands of the AK. The price paid in blood was heavy, but the AK acquired a large number of arms and ammunition, a precious commodity for the resource-constrained organization. Elsewhere in the Mokotów district, the other members of the Baszta regiment paid a much steeper price. Over half the regiment's officers were killed. Other soldiers in the regiment moved south into the Kabatsky forest to seek refuge after they failed to take their objectives.
And they gave me a pistol and a hand grenade. And I was in the game.
As the sun rose over Warsaw on the morning of August 2nd, massive fires continued to rage across the city. The rainstorm had done little to extinguish the fires. The railway center in Praga and many of the more extensive facilities in the city were burning out of control. The AK now controlled Old Town, City Center, and the Wola district. The Germans controlled the airport, the airfields, and all the bridges over the Wisła. While the fighting in the police quarter was heavy, neither the AK nor the Germans had gained a clear advantage. The Poles continued to wait for the arrival of the Red Army. Day 2 of the uprising would see the AK's consolidation of its earlier gains in the city center, its seizure of the council hall, the post office, the stocks and securities exchange, and the power plant offset initial failures and strengthened its positions. The AK had also captured 2 Panther tanks. The 2 newly acquired tanks and a Hetzer tank destroyer represented the entirety of the AK's armor during the uprising. Using one of the captured Panthers, an enterprising cavalry officer and 15 volunteers attacked Ganszówka prison, or Goose Farm, located inside what had been the Jewish ghetto. Inside the small concentration camp were some 300 Jewish prisoners from across Europe, including Dutch, French, Hungarian, and others. The AK welded a metal rod and plate to the front of the Panther and then used it to create a breach point in the wall. The SS guards were no match for the tank, and Captain Mikuta, the officer in command, and his men quickly secured the compound. Initially, the prisoners inside Goose Farm were unsure what to make of what had just happened. When they realized the soldiers were wearing the red and white armbands of the AK, they rejoiced. This success, as well as the taking of the tobacco monopoly factory, filled with non-perishable food and cigarettes, seemed to indicate that the AK was making slow but steady progress. The sound of explosions far to the north and south of Warsaw added to a general feeling of optimism. They hoped they would not have to hold out much longer. The deafening silence to the east and the lack of Soviet aircraft over the city were indicators that the storm that overtook Warsaw would only worsen. Meanwhile, inside Brühl Palace, Governor General Hans Frank, Brigadier General Stahl, and their staff of roughly 157 personnel were trapped. The AK had isolated the palace on the first day of the uprising, trapping Frank, Stahl, and the others inside. The loss of the telephone exchange meant that German communication with the outside world was limited to UHF radio. This made it challenging, but not impossible, to direct the fight from inside the palace. By the end of the second day, the AK controlled most of the city west of the Wisła River, but they had not been able to seize a single bridge. Additionally, there had been no contact with the Soviets. In Moscow, Foreign Minister Molotov had assured the Polish Prime Minister that Soviet forces under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky were only hours away from liberating Warsaw. The Poles continued to operate and plan under the assumption the Soviets would soon arrive. Urban defense will likely occur amongst the people, around networks and cities, and may be more decisive in later stages of major operations. Urban operations defense may use deliberate, layered preparation, such as construction of obstacles, mutually supporting fighting positions, and reinforced urban defensive positions. These become strong points. The most effective counter-mobility tool used by the AK were the hundreds of simple street barricades emplaced across the city. Much of the combat was centered around these obstacles, which significantly restricted the German armored vehicles' freedom of movement. When the tactical situation allowed, the AK implemented a clear plan to restrict the Germans' movement and funnel their combined arms teams into engagement areas of the AK's choosing. The fighting around Old Town was fierce. The Germans repeatedly attempted to breach the barricade at Piwna Street that led directly to the Old Town's Market Square. Prepared urban operation defenses around large buildings support counter-mobility of enemy forces. By design, and without additional defender effort, these obstacles funnel and canalize forces into streets and areas transformed into engagement areas. Well-positioned defensive forces in mutually supporting battle positions observe and cover obstacles by fire, developing engagement areas to prevent enemy infiltration. Defenders enjoy minimal obstacle construction efforts using point obstacles in streets to restrict movement and maneuver options of the attacking force. Intentionally creating structure rubble can block routes.
Preparation in this terrain is going to look a lot different than preparing in an open desert or in even the complex terrain of Eastern Europe with, hills, microterrain, vegetation. You're going to need to bring different things. The urban infrastructure needs to be thoroughly assessed so you can identify what your best location is to really set up your battle positions. And then what you need to do to reinforce those. We want to understand where we have the fields of fire, what we can observe, how it's going to mess with our C2, our command and control. We want to understand where we can cache additional ammo because we're going to be going through a lot. We want to understand where we can position our role 1, our role 2, so that we can immediately get casualties back and start working on them. We need to understand exactly how we're going to communicate between battle positions. Is it a situation where we can use wire in order to really hide our electromagnetic signature, but also build redundancy in our pace plan so that the enemy can't take out our ability to communicate?
The AK's Vigre Battalion was tasked with defending the vital sector. Piwna Street was only 3 meters wide at its entrance, too narrow for German tanks to move through. The Poles built the barricades far enough down the street that the German infantry had to move down a narrow funnel, with 3-story buildings on either side and occupied by soldiers of the Vigre Battalion. Army Techniques publication 3-06 states, "Urban terrain increases the utility and effects of snipers and anti-armor teams, increasing overall combat power. In urban operations, snipers or hunter-killer teams, well concealed, positioned, and protected, take on significance disproportionate to their combat capability in other situations. Prepared urban operation defenses around buildings, conceal location, disposition, and intent of the defense. Buildings limit visual observation to the external perimeter of the urban area. They degrade radar and electronic position identifiers and decrease the utility of overhead imagery. Physical aspects of the urban environment enhance defense by degrading the opposition's ISR capabilities. Buildings conceal static defensive positions within their superstructure and aid the maneuver of defensive forces in an urban area. It remained to be seen if the AK could hold these barricades given their critical shortage of crew-served and anti-tank weapons. To compensate for this shortage, the AK allocated these weapons to the most likely enemy avenues of approach, while keeping a quick reaction force nearby should the Germans deviate from their most likely course of action.
That's going to be the spot. We need to build a bunch and allow the infantry to move from point to point to point. We need to best understand how we can do counter mobility in the urban. Is that moving a bunch of broken down cars to locations to block off? I think one of the things that strikes any strategist or tactician is the amount of avenues of approach you're going to find in the urban environment. And if you can't find ways to stop the enemy from using those, they can come from anywhere.
For 10 years, Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler had actively sought ways to increase his military authority and power inside Germany. He controlled the Nazi intelligence operations, V1 and V2 rocket sites, and the SS. But Warsaw, at least from his perspective, presented him with an opportunity to demonstrate his abilities as a military commander. In a meeting at the beginning of the uprising, he implored Hitler to allow him to take control of the crisis. Himmler's solution to the Polish question was to erase the entire nation. He claimed, "This Volk has blocked our way to the east for 700 years." Hitler agreed, stating that it was imperative to raze Warsaw to the ground and crush the center of the uprising. Not content to just end the uprising, Hitler and Himmler decided on an even more barbaric course of action. The order read, "Every citizen of Warsaw is to be killed, including men, women, and children. There would be no prisoners."
Uprising started. Hitler wanted the whole, everybody in Warsaw slaughtered, murdered. So the first group, which were prisoners who they released and sent to fight in Warsaw with the uprising, and they had the I don't know, regiment or even more. These beasts murder civilians, everybody, hospitals and so on.
For the task of crushing the uprising, Himmler chose some of the most notorious SS leaders to conduct the operations on the ground. He selected two ruthless commanders. SS Gruppenführer Heinz Reinfarth to assume command of all SS forces in Warsaw, and the Nazi anti-partisan expert SS Obergruppenführer Erich Vandenbach-Zelewski to assume overall military command of the city. Although the Germans were pressed on multiple fronts, Himmler scraped together roughly 8,000 troops along with armor and artillery. Reinfarth's plan was relatively simple. His units would maneuver from the west, through the Wola district, supported by an attack from the southwest through the Ochota district. The tactical goals of this attack would be to divide the city in half, secure one or more of the still intact bridges over the Wisła River, and break the siege of Brühl Palace. For this attack, Reinfarth was supported by the Luftwaffe, as well as artillery and engineer units. Two brigades were specifically selected for this operation, one based off its ruthlessness towards partisans, the other based off its ruthlessness toward Poles. The SS Sturmbrigade Dirlewanger, also known as die Schwarzen Jäger, or the Black Hunters, led by SS Oberführer Oskar Dirlewanger, a convicted child molester and murderer. The 2nd Brigade, SS Sturmbrigade Rona, led by Brigadenführer Bronislaw Władysławowicz Stroganov Kamiński. The Rona Brigade was a group of anti-Soviets who had previously been prisoners of war at Nazi concentration camps in Eastern Europe. The two brigades arrived in Warsaw on 4 August 1944 and were immediately thrown into the attack. Dirlewanger split his force into two Kampfgruppen, Meyer and Steinhauser, named after their commanders. The brigade was tasked with moving from its assembly area near the eastern quarter along an axis of advance toward the central square, with Brühl Palace as its objective. Kampfgruppe Meyer was tasked with creating a penetration of the Polish line, while Kampfgruppe Steinhauer would exploit the penetration, reducing the isolated pockets of Polish resistance before securing the objective. With complete air superiority and no fear of Polish artillery, it still took Meyer's troops 3 days to create a penetration of the Polish lines, at which time the AK counterattacked with what it had available and sealed the penetration. The AK made the SS pay dearly for every meter gained. Kampfgruppe Meyer began the action with 356 soldiers, but by 7 August it had lost 310 personnel. Although the AK did not have enough small arms for all its soldiers and little ammunition, its marksmanship paid huge dividends. In the southwest, Kamiński's Rona brigades supporting the attack stalled almost immediately, but not from AK resistance. Kamiński and his soldiers were focused entirely on looting and getting drunk rather than retaking the city. They relayed fraudulent progress reports to Reinfarth and his staff, claiming AK resistance was too fierce. Their lack of discipline and generally poor performance was the breaking point. In late August, Kamiński was ordered to attend a staff meeting outside Warsaw. While en route, he and his party were intercepted by the Gestapo. To breach the barricade on Piwna Street, Dirlewanger tasked a platoon from the Azerbaijani battalion, supported by a flamethrower team and a Sturmgeschütz assault gun. The barricade had been constructed from concrete and rubble found in the area. The 75mm gun from the vehicle had little effect. The platoon attempted to breach by going over the barricade. The lead squad was destroyed by highly disciplined fire from overwatching AK soldiers. They waited until the squad was on top of the obstacle, exposed to open fire. Polish snipers on the upper floors of the buildings on either side of the barricade eliminated the platoon's NCOs and the flamethrower team. The AK then used Molotov cocktails and petrol bombs to destroy the remaining troops and neutralize the assault gun. It became a brutal fight. In Dirlewanger's sector, the brutality of the fighting was matched by the brigade's cruelty. Matthias Schenk, a Wehrmacht sapper attached to the brigade, initially had no idea which SS unit he had been attached to. He claimed, "They looked very strange. They had no markings of rank on their uniforms, and they smelled of vodka. They attacked right away with a loud hurrah, and they died by the dozen. Their commander, dressed in a black leather coat, was at the back of the unit yelling at his people to attack." Schenk later learned that the individual in the black leather jacket was Dirlewanger himself. The brigade had a difficult transition from fighting partisans in the swamps and forests of Byelorussia to the complex urban terrain of Warsaw. Dirlewanger and his troops were technically and tactically incompetent in the urban environment.
Urban warfare is the hardest because you're conducting operations in an urban environment where there's a terrain. You have your buildings, tall buildings, you have low-rise buildings, you have subterranean areas, you have the presence of civilian population, and you have critical infrastructure, essential services such as electricity, power grids, hospitals, that are essential for the survival of the civilian population. So for any military to try to conduct operations is going to be extremely difficult, because no matter how prepared a military can be, a lot of times for an attacking force, sometimes the military objectives are in civilian areas. And the proximity of military objectives to the civilian population just heightens the risk for civilians when warfare takes place in the urban environment. The framework of the law of armed conflict was created to reduce human suffering, we should not be going back to that time, but we should be doing better to, study the past to inform how we can better train, have better policies, have better munitions for the kind of challenges of the urban environment.
The AK made them pay for their ineptitude. With their progress through the Wola district checked by AK resistance, Dirlevanger's troops began murdering civilians, including the elderly and children. Civilians were raped and then brutally executed. Wounded in hospitals were not spared, with Dirlevanger's troops bayoneting or shooting all the patients in several hospitals and then raping the nurses. Between 40 and 50,000 Polish civilians were murdered by the SS between 5 and 12 August. On 8 August, Reinfarth renewed the attack to recapture Brühl Palace, which had been under siege for a little over a week. The Germans attacked simultaneously from the northwest, with a composite force made up of Dirlewanger and Schmidt's Kampfgruppen using an axis of advance that took them through the cemetery, while Dirlewanger's other units continued their attack from the Hala Miroska through the Saskia Gardens. The cemetery was divided along denominational lines, with the Jewish cemetery to the furthest west, followed by the Evangelical cemetery and the Calvinist cemetery. The AK defended this area with the Zoska battalion in the Jewish and Evangelical sections. The Broda battalion, with the addition of 3 armored vehicles, defended the Calvinist section along Okopna Street with their backs to what had been the Jewish ghetto 1 year earlier. Area defenses are typically used when insufficient maneuver space exists to conduct a mobile defense. The purpose of the defense is to create conditions for the offense that allows U.S. forces to regain the initiative. Other reasons for conducting the defense include retaining decisive terrain or denying a vital area to an enemy, attrit or fix an enemy as a prelude to the offense, countering enemy action, increasing an enemy's vulnerability by forcing an enemy commander to concentrate subordinate forces. The Polish commanders used Karlkowa Street as a boundary between their forces. The Poles were still under strength, defending with roughly 1,500 soldiers between the 3 elements in a space approximately 1,600 meters in length by 800 meters in width. The urban environment restricts defenders' ability to mass and concentrate overwhelming combat power against an attacking enemy due to limits on maneuver space and line of sight. Restrictive terrain reduces all forces' maneuver options, whether attacking or defending. Defenders position forces in protected and mutually supportive primary, alternate, supplementary, subsequent, and strongpoint engagement areas. Relatively few well-positioned defenders can generate significant lethal effects. Without positional advantage and corresponding protective effects of the terrain, defenders should expect attacking forces to mass numbers to achieve the necessary combat power to overcome this advantage. Commanders accept certain risks to mass effects at decisive points or for their main efforts. Concentrating forces increase the risk of large-scale losses from enemy fires and weapons of mass destruction. Commanders mitigate this risk by using dispersion, cover, and concealment and military deception to mass at precisely the correct time and to avoid detection of friendly troop concentrations by enemy ISR assets. Reinfarth's forces initiated the attack using something that might have been better suited for the Russian Civil War, an armored train. The Germans used artillery and mortars from the train in an attempt to destroy the units near Okopna Street. Infantry then advanced, with an Azerbaijani battalion in the lead and armor in support. Late in the morning, the Poles counterattacked, supported by the 3 captured armored vehicles, driving the Germans off. 3 hours later, the Germans attacked a second time. Again, the Poles counterattacked, supported by the 3 armored vehicles. They drove the Germans off, this time capturing 3 heavy machine guns, but losing a third of their armor. On the third attempt, the fighting was at close quarters, in among the gravestones, crypts, and mausoleums of the cemetery. While the Poles were pushed back, by 2000 that evening, they had launched a third counterattack, this time from the Calvinist cemetery, retaking both the evangelical and Jewish cemeteries from the Germans. The AK's losses were heavy, but they captured valuable weapons and ammunition. The AK was able to continue to hold the cemetery until the evening of 11 August, when they withdrew the remnants of the 2 battalions back into the city center, while a rear guard of 25 soldiers covered their movement.
So the advantages for the defender in complex urban terrain is that he has to spend a lot less time preparing a defense. The unique nature of the urban terrain makes it immensely defendable. It is almost already military-grade fortification. Think about a heavy building, concrete reinforced steel.
Operation Tempest, originally conceived as a 3 to 4 day operation, now entered its second week. There was still no sign of the Red Army. As the Germans applied pressure to the increasingly isolated pockets of Polish resistance, survival became paramount in the minds of commanders. The massacre in Wola had driven more civilians inside the perimeter of the old town and city center. But with the Germans methodically reducing these pockets, the AK's leadership desperately sought a solution to their problem. They had neither air assets nor control of an airfield, so evacuation via aircraft was out of the question. On the rubble-strewn streets of Warsaw, movement of any kind was typically met with overwhelming firepower that the AK could neither match nor even counter on a limited scale. This left only one reliable option for the AK: the sewers. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, the Jewish underground had effectively used the sewers underneath the ghetto to move personnel, supplies, and Jewish prisoners interned in the ghetto through the sewers to safety. Now the AK would try its hand at doing something similar. The Germans, for their part, had been slow to catch on how the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, ZOB, one of many Jewish resistance organizations, have been able to seemingly vanish into thin air.
So with subterranean operations, it is really a space that is below the subsurface. It can encompass different categories. Category 1 being tunnels, caves, natural kind of features. Category 2 can be existing structures like parking garages, subway tunnels. And then category 3 can be military grade. Underground nuclear facilities, missile sites. And through these categorizations, we're able to develop a holistic picture of what a subterranean environment might encompass. Have conversations about the space, acknowledging what type of environments may be in the subterranean. An experience as somebody from Washington, D.C. may understand the metro within Washington, D.C. can incorporate shopping districts attached to that. And so that adds on a more complex environment that we may need to understand.
In this subterranean environment, junction points, manhole covers, and drain outlets became key terrain. The loss of one of these points meant the inability to send and receive messages, replacements, resupply, or worse, to retreat.
So the Polish fighters were able to mass effects during the Warsaw Uprising by using the subterranean network as their avenues of approach to conduct offensive operations in different areas of the Germans, the Nazi consolidation or support areas. I think the Poles were able to mass effects utilizing the subterranean network because it provided freedom of maneuver around the city to conduct their offensive operations and pick their point of contact and how they wanted to engage. Subterranean network provided the Polish fighters flexibility because it is such a versatile system. You can use it for offensive operations when they seized the radio broadcasting building. They can use it for the defense, so as a point defense where they wanted to retain key terrain. such as the city center, for as long as they could, or they could simply use it to buy time and space. And so they were able to attrit at different points in the operation that allowed them to sustain their force.
And he said, this is the master of sewers. And he made a plan of sewers, which will come in the back of the German front. So he said, take another fellow from my second in command. So two of us went, and the sewer was walking, and in the middle, very, very rapidly moving, very smelly, a stream of soot. But when we went, we got to that place, and they had iron steps to it. So I told Henrik to stay back here, and if you had any noises, to run, because they'd be throwing hand grenades. And I told him, there's nothing you can defend me. Once the Germans find me, I'm dead.
With the Germans pressing their attack into Old Town, Bor Komorowski and his officers chose to use the sewers to evacuate as many civilians as possible. Yitzhak Zuckerman, a leader within the AL, was tasked with leading a group of a few hundred soldiers and civilians. Their route would take them out of the city center to Zoliborz, one of the northern sections of Warsaw, where they might be able to slip away into the forests north of the city. Once in the sewers, the darkness and the confined space caused the journey to take several tension-filled hours. The stench of human excrement was overpowering at times, amplified by the increasingly narrow space in which the oxygen seemed to lessen as time went on. Near dawn, they came to a three-way junction in the sewer tunnel. The Germans actively booby-trapped and monitored the sewer system, often using a series of hidden wires that would trigger an alarm above. When members of Zuckerman's party tripped the wire, the Germans dropped hand grenades down through the manhole. In the ensuing chaos, Zuckerman was able to regain control of the situation, although several members of the party went missing. By noon, the group arrived underneath the manhole cover in Kraskiego Square, where they linked up with a squad of soldiers who escorted them to safety.
Well, the defenders have usually been in an urban environment for days, weeks, or even months. And so as a result, they're very familiar with the entirety of the urban terrain, the surface, the buildings on the surface, the high-rise structures, and the subterranean. Whereas the attacking force may not have that familiarity. They don't have the intelligence to have done a proper intelligence preparation of that particular urban environment. So that gives the defenders the immediate advantage of being able to quickly attack or withdraw or counterattack, because they know the terrain because they've been there for so long. As an example, there was a group of Polish teenage girls who were able to use the sewer systems in Warsaw to be able to communicate messages and direction from the headquarters out to some of the military groups that were further out in the city. Because the Polish knew about these systems, because they were intimate with the city and how it was laid out, and all of these different methods of being able to advance and withdraw using the subterranean systems, using the buildings that existed already.
The AK leadership made no coordinated effort to break through to the defenders of Old Town. While the forces in the city center sat idle, the AK chose to focus on seizing the police quarter in the Mokotów district, which they were able to achieve, but only at great cost. On 14 August, the Germans turned off the city's water supply, increasing the deprivation of the civilians and defenders alike. Inside the city center, the last German defenders isolated in the Post building ran out of rations. By 20 August, 115 German troops surrendered to the AK, ceding control of the second largest building in Warsaw. The AK finally attempted to relieve the Old Town on 30 August, but this attempt failed. The AK issued evacuation orders to the defenders of the Old Town. Volunteers and the wounded covered the withdrawal of 4,500 soldiers who exfiltrated through the sewers. The barricade on Pivna Street, defended by the Vigry Battalion, was never breached by the Germans. As September began, the AK was still in control of large swaths of the city. The Polish Air Force and RAF airlifts helped with supplies, but the AK was running out of time.
The military is high, and for the civilians, I think they started to be low, because they were getting water was difficult, getting food was difficult, and they had to sit in the basements. A lot of time they couldn't come out because of the snipers and bombing and so on. And so they were really so many weeks, so many days, pretty desperate in that sense. But none of them thought us to capitulate. No, they were tired, but they were supportive.
On the 2nd of September, Bohr-Komorowski radioed London that despite the loss of the Old Town, he had decided to defend Warsaw to the limit of possibility. We have food until September 7, bread until September 5th, nearly exhausted ammunition. The spirit of the soldiers is good. The possibility of holding out does not depend only on our stamina, but rather on help from you or the speed of the Soviet success on our sector. That same day, the Germans began to fire on the city center with 380mm and 600mm mortars. The silence to the east was broken at last. The Soviets finally began to move on Warsaw. On 5 September, the Soviet 47th Army, supported by the 8th Tank Corps and the understrength and poorly equipped 1st Polish Infantry Division, penetrated 3 thinly manned German defensive lines and entered the eastern side of the Praga district. In support of this attack, the Soviet 70th Army attacked north of the Praga district, albeit with negligible gains. The Soviets also attempted to answer Bohr-Komorowski's pleas for material assistance. The Red Air Force re-established control of the airspace above Warsaw. To meet the AK's material needs, they airdropped light artillery, mortars, flamethrowers, anti-tank weapons, and small arms and ammunition. The Soviets conducted aerial resupply operations for the AK at heights of only 20 to 30 meters. The air crews literally pushed the palletized equipment out the door without a parachute, and gravity did the rest. Virtually all the equipment was destroyed upon impact with the ground. On 10 September, Stalin finally agreed to allow American aircraft based in England to refuel at Soviet airfields. Operation Frantic attempted a resupply on 15 September, but the mission was aborted due to poor weather. A few days later, a second attempt was made, with over 100 B-17s airdropping approximately 1,200 parachute containers. Less than 250 of these actually reached the AK. Meanwhile, the Red Army finally took the Praga district and secured the eastern bank of the Wisła River. They established radio communications with the AK and, for the first time, gained a picture of the grim situation inside Warsaw. Polish units affiliated with the Red Army attempted multiple assault river crossings of the Wisła. The under-equipped and poorly trained Polish troops met with disaster each time. The inability of the Allies to reinforce and resupply the AK sealed the fate of the uprising.
The morale of the soldiers, in AK soldiers in the uprising, it was very high. Especially, I of course can talk about my own company.
The humanitarian situation inside the isolated areas still held by the AK was worsening. SS Obergruppenführer Erich Vandenbach-Zelewski offered to negotiate surrender terms with the AK. Komorowski slow-played his response to buy more time for the Soviets now occupying the Praga district and the possibility of resupply. By the end of the month, it was apparent to the AK leadership that their time had run out. Not wanting the campaign of attrition to continue, Vandenbach-Zelewski agreed and gave his guarantee in writing that the soldiers of the AK would not be treated as partisans, but afforded all the rights and guarantees afforded prisoners of war by the Geneva Convention. On 4 October 1944, the AK surrendered to the Germans, ending the Warsaw Uprising. According to the terms of surrender, the remaining civilian population of Warsaw was removed from the city. Between 350,000 and 550,000 civilians were processed in Durchgangslager 121. Approximately 90,000 of these individuals were sent to labor camps, while 60,000 went to concentration camps at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Mauthausen. The soldiers of the AK went to various prisoner of war camps inside the Reich.
And at that time, when that happened, the Soviet army was across Vistula. And that also, I think, influenced them, that the idea was that we liberate Warsaw before the Soviets. But we didn't.
During the Warsaw Uprising, the AK had more than 15,000 soldiers killed, along with another 15,000 who were marched off to prisoner of war camps. It is estimated that 150 to 200,000 Polish civilians were killed during the uprising, along with 700,000 who were forcibly expelled from the city. The Germans lost comparable numbers in dead and missing, but a casualty count is a poor metric for determining success or failure in combat. The Nazis defeated the uprising, but at a very high cost in lives and material. The AK failed to achieve their objective of liberating Warsaw and ultimately surrendered. The lack of material support from the Western Allies and the Soviets' inability to reach Warsaw in a timely manner doomed the uprising. Operation Tempest, as it was conceived and planned for by the AK and the government in exile in London, was expected to last 72 hours. It lasted for 63 days. The Soviets did eventually liberate Warsaw after the surrender of the AK, and the entire surviving population had been forcibly relocated after the Germans razed the city to the ground.
When the Red Army finally reaches Warsaw on January 17, 1945, it is the sole liberator of the city's charred remains. Poland's future is to become Moscow's satellite. It is the end of the tragedy of a great and living city, victimized by two dictators, the Nazi Hitler, the Red Stalin.
Silni jak stal, oczy patrzą się w dal, nikt nie znaczy nam wojny pożoga. Hej, kotoli nas krok, nasz strężycy krok i pogarda dla śmierci i wroga. Gotuj broń, naprzód nasz, ku zwycięstwu, dumem broń orzeł nasz losy zbił. Silni jak stal, oczy patrzą się w dal, hej, do walki nie zbraknie nam sił. Chłopcy silni jak stal, oczy patrzą się w dal, hej, do walki nie zbraknie nam sił.
During the occasional lulls, the people of the underground can still relax and live before they die.